I believe, like Ken was saying this morning, that there is to be something that is to be a signal to get out. And I want to know when that is and what that is. I agree with this. But I'm going to show a little different perspective. Now, I'd like to begin by asking the question, is this really present truth? Is it really present truth? Because this morning, I was emphasizing present truth and how important it is. Is it present truth? I believe it is. I believe that when Jesus said, "When therefore you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing in the holy place," he was giving his people a message of importance, something that was salvational. He gave them this message, and they listened to him, they took his advice seriously, and they responded at the proper time. Amen. Most of us believe that this prophecy has a double application, Amen. That it applies to in the end time also. And I think when you look at the book of Daniel, you'll find reason to believe, yes, it does have another application. Now, I'm going to ask Brother Howard to bring this board around here because I might use it. I might or I might not, but we'll see. Now, I want us to start by going to the verses in Matthew that speak about the abomination of desolation, the verses that Jesus spoke about. Matthew 24 is the first one. Matthew 24, and I think it's verse, tell you in a moment, verse 15. It says, "When you therefore shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, stand in the holy place, whoso readeth, let him understand." Now, I don't know if you notice, but if you have looked at this phrase, you will notice that this phrase does not appear in the book of Daniel. Did you recognize that? Yes. The phrase abomination of desolation does not appear in the book of Daniel. It's stated differently. It says in chapter 12 and chapter 11, the abomination that causes desolation. And in actual fact, it says it in also Daniel chapter 8 and Daniel chapter 9. It speaks about an abomination and it speaks about desolation. But Jesus phrases it this way, the abomination of desolation. And he says it was to stand in the holy place, but he gives a little condition, a little qualification. He says, anybody who is reading this, you need to understand. And there's a reason why he says this, because what he's saying is that the interpretation of this abomination of desolation is not superficial. I think he's saying the application I'm giving to this abomination of desolation is not the only interpretation. So be careful when you read this prophecy. It's not every place that you see a Bible writer says, here's an interpretation. But the one who reads, be careful that you understand. He's saying there's more to it than meets the eye. So, although we look at Jesus' interpretation, let's not take that as the final word. In fact, I'm going to show you as we go to the book of Daniel that Jesus is speaking of specifically something that we can identify clearly. The next place where Jesus spoke about this was in Mark 13 and verse 14. He says, "But when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet, standing where it ought not, let him that readeth understand, then let them that be in Judea flee to the mountains." So first of all, he says, you will see this abomination standing where? In the holy place. And then he says here in Mark, it will stand where? Where it ought not. It's not supposed to be standing. Same thing, right? It's not supposed to stand in the holy place. And we'll see where he gives us a little more information in Luke chapter 21 and verse 20. Speaking of the same thing, he says, we can probably read verses 20 and 21. "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh." He doesn't mention abomination of desolation, but he mentions the desolation of Jerusalem. "Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out, and let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto. So now he gives us more detail, and he tells us, when you see Jerusalem surrounded with armies, then it's time to get out, it's time to flee. Now you know this happened exactly as Jesus specified. And I'm going to come back to this later on. But obviously what he means is the armies surrounding Jerusalem is equivalent to the abomination standing where it ought not in the holy place. And the disciples were to look for this. They had a definite event that they were to look at. And when they saw it happening, they were to look for the first opportunity and get out fast. And we know they did. And Jesus says, this is what his people were to do. And I'm suggesting to you that there is more than one application to this, because there is something that is to signify in the end of time, a signal for God's people to respond in a certain way. And that's the important thing to remember. That's the main point in what I'm saying tonight. There's a certain question in the minds of some people here tonight. And I hope that by the time we are finished, you will at least have a better answer to the question. If not a perfect answer, at least a better answer. Okay? Now let's look at the actual prophecies in Daniel that Jesus was quoting, because I think Daniel puts it differently, and I want to say something about Daniel's presentations. Now, first of all, let's look at Daniel chapter 12 and verse 11. All right, he says in Daniel 12 and verse 11, and from the time that the daily sacrifice shall be taken away, and the abomination that maketh desolate set up, there shall be 1,290 days. Now there are two elements that he mentions I want to write on the board. He speaks about the daily sacrifice. Right, I think everybody knows that the word sacrifice is a supplied word. And he speaks about the abomination. And he speaks about making desolate. I want to focus on these three words. There's another word that appears in the other places in Daniel. I don't know if anybody can tell me what that word is. It's missing. I left a space for it. What's the other word? Anybody knows? We'll look and you'll see in a moment. But he talks about the daily. Sister Janet says the word sacrifice doesn't belong in the original, and that's true. The King James translators put in the word sacrifice because they thought it belonged there. But in the original in which this was written, it's simply the word daily. And that word has caused a lot of controversy because people are saying, what is this daily? And they have all kinds of interpretations. In fact, the early Adventist pioneers believed that it meant paganism. And I'll tell you now, I hope it doesn't offend you, but I absolutely do not agree with that. All right? If that's not your understanding, I hope I can explain why I don't agree with it. I will try to do that. So the daily is to be taken away, and then the abomination that makes desolate. There's a certain abomination, and this abomination causes desolation. I'm going to look at each of these words a little more closely, and we'll see what we can learn. But the other word that is missing, let's go to Daniel 11 and verse 31, and we'll find the missing word. It says, and arms shall stand on his part, and they shall pollute the sanctuary of strength, and they shall take away the daily sacrifice, and they shall place the abomination that maketh desolate. What other concept is brought in here that wasn't mentioned? The sanctuary, thank you. They shall pollute the sanctuary of strength. The sanctuary is mentioned. Now just bear this in mind, and we want to look at the other two places where this is mentioned in the book of Daniel. One of those places is very evident, the other place is a bit obscure, but you'll recognize it. Let's go to Daniel 8. Now here's where some of our pioneers, I think, came up with an interpretation that I don't agree with. Look at what it says, beginning in verse 12 and verse 13. And while we're reading, I want you to refer to what I have written on the board. It says, and an host was given him against the daily sacrifice. There's that daily again. By reason of transgression, and it cast down the truth to the ground, and it practiced and prospered. Then I heard one saint speaking, and another saint said unto that certain saint which spake, how long shall be the vision concerning the daily sacrifice and the transgression of desolation? He doesn't say abomination here, he says transgression. To give both the sanctuary and the host to be trodden underfoot. So it has the elements of the daily, the sanctuary, and the abomination. It mentions all three things. So the parallel between this and Daniel 11 and Daniel 12 is very clear. The elements are there. The daily, the sanctuary, and the abomination of desolation. So, let me tell you before I go to the final reference what I believe. I believe that at least three of these references are talking about three different time periods. Three different time periods, but the same crisis, the same elements come back three different times. It's expressed differently each time, but it's a repetition of the same event in a different setting. Jesus gave us one of those events, and he gave us the interpretation one time to act as a kind of template to know how we can interpret the other two instances. It may be four. I see at least three, right? But let's go to the other instance, which is in Daniel 9. Let's go to Daniel 9. Now, Daniel 9, we look at verses 26 and 27. And I want you to look for these elements again. I believe this is a prophecy Jesus was referring to when he told his disciples to look for the abomination of desolation. This prophecy in Daniel 9. This is the prophecy that pinpoints the Messiah and tells you what will happen in terms of his crucifixion, and it describes the destruction of Jerusalem. It does not mention the abomination of desolation, but abomination is there, desolation is there, the daily sacrifice is there, the sanctuary is there. Look at it. In verse 26. And after 62 weeks shall Messiah be cut off, but not for himself. And the people of the prince that shall come shall destroy the city and the sanctuary. There's the sanctuary. And the end thereof shall be with a flood, and unto the end of the war, desolations are determined. There's the desolation. And he shall confirm the covenant with many for 1 week, and in the midst of the week, he shall cause the sacrifice and the oblation to cease. There's the daily sacrifice. And for the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate. There's the desolate. For the overspreading of abominations, he shall make it desolate, even until the consummation, and that determined shall be poured out upon the desolate. So you see, all these elements are here in this prophecy concerning the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, before really digging into it a little bit, I want to try to look at what do these things represent? What do they mean? Let's see if we can get a practical idea. Now, the daily has caused a lot of confusion. What is this daily? When you go to the Bible, you find that the word daily is translated from the Hebrew word tamid. Tamid. Go to your Bible and use a Strong's Concordance or whatever you wish and look for the word tamid. You'll find that when the word tamid comes up, it first appears in the Bible in connection with the Levitical system. The Levitical system is full of this word tamid. It has particular reference to the sanctuary service. In fact, I could just ask you to look quickly at a few references and you'll see what I mean. It says, in Numbers 28 and verse 24. In fact, I'll just read quickly. You don't have to go to the verses unless you're really fast with your hand. I want to go through this without spending too much time. In Numbers 28 and verse 24, it says, after this manner you shall offer daily throughout the 7 days the meat of the sacrifice made by fire of a sweet savor unto the Lord. When it says you shall offer daily, it's that word tamid. It says it shall be offered beside the continual burnt offering. The word continual is the word tamid. It's translated as continual. It's translated as always. It's translated as daily. It has to do over and over with the sanctuary service. In Exodus 25 and verse 30 it says, "And thou shalt set upon the table showbread before me always." Tamid. Again, it says in Exodus 28 and verse 29, "And Aaron shall bear the names of the children of Israel in the breastplate of judgment upon his heart, when he goeth in unto the holy place for a memorial before the Lord continually." Tamid again. And you find that it is used here over and over, many, many places in the book of, in relation to the sanctuary service. It is full of this word tamid. So when you find that the book of Daniel, the angel talks about the daily being taken away, and it's always in connection with the sanctuary. The sanctuary is in almost every one of these references to the abomination of desolation. It seems reasonable and logical to me to conclude that the daily is referring to the sanctuary service. I am sorry, I have to disagree with our pioneers. They said it was paganism. Tamid never, ever, not even one time in the Bible refers to paganism. They made a mistake. But it refers to the sanctuary service. And I just want to ask you right at the beginning, what is the meaning of the sanctuary service? What does it point to? Everything in it. The showbread on the table, the priest with the breastplate on his, the names of Israel on his breastplate, the offerings offered morning and evening, the lamp being made to burn continually. Everything referred to the fact that Jesus ever lives continually to make intercession for us. Always. So, I believe it has reference, first of all, to the sanctuary service, and then you have to ask yourself, as you move past AD 31, when Christ was crucified, and you look at the sanctuary service, are we talking about the literal sanctuary service, or are we talking about the real ministry of Christ? These questions. Then, the abomination that maketh desolate. I'm not going to spend too much time on this either, but you can go to the Bible and look up the word desolate. Many, many places you'll find where, in fact, probably I can find an example to give you. I think I got my notes a little mixed up here, but I'll find for you in just a moment. It talks about desolate, and when it talks about desolate, it refers to a state or a condition of being forsaken by God. I'll give you two examples. In Leviticus 28 and verse 26, and verse 31, God speaks about what he will do to the Jews if they turn away from him, what will happen to the Jews. And he says in verse 31, "And I will make your cities waste, and bring your sanctuaries into desolation, and I will not smell the savor of your sweet odors." What's the meaning of this word desolation? Worthless. Let me give you another example of the use of it. Isaiah 24 and verse 6. It says, "Therefore hath the curse devoured the earth, and they that dwell therein are desolate. Therefore the inhabitants of the earth are burned, and few men left." What does desolate mean? Empty in this place. But when you look at all the instances where it is used, something comes to my mind. It is the primary meaning I get is that desolate means something forsaken by God. Yes. Forsaken by God. Your house is left unto you desolate, as Jesus says, right? So we have the concept of the sanctuary service being taken away, and as a consequence, some abomination enters, and the consequence of this abomination is that the place is forsaken by God. Now, I believe that primarily this is what the abomination of desolation is suggesting. The thing that stands between the presence of God and the absence of God, the thing that determines whether or not God's favor remains, is whether or not this abomination is put in place. When the abomination is put in place, whatever it is an indication that God's presence is gone. Now, these are the elements of the prophecy. Now, I want to take a little time and look at how it was fulfilled in Jesus' day. And I want us to look carefully, because I believe to understand the abomination of desolation, we need to look at the pattern. What happened, how it was fulfilled, and then try to use that as a template to look at the other fulfillments, and especially the end of time. Now, here's what happened. I guess that those Jews never understood, the disciples never understood perfectly what Jesus meant. But they had their eyes open. They had some kind of idea. When Jesus spoke of the holy place, I wonder what they had in mind. But he said some abomination of desolation is to stand in the holy place. And then they understood, when you see Jerusalem compassed with armies. So in AD 66, the Roman armies led by Cestius Gallus assaulted Jerusalem, surrounded the city, and placed the standards, the emblems of Rome's dominance and superiority in the holy ground that surrounded Jerusalem. It's interesting that up to this point they didn't attack the sanctuary. But what they did, they planted the flags in the holy ground that surrounded Jerusalem. And the disciples, with all the rest of the Jews, were anxiously looking from the city. In the providence of God, the Roman armies mysteriously withdrew. After a while, I understand that there was some disturbance in Rome, and they pulled back. But of course, the Jews had no idea what was happening. They just saw that this huge Roman army withdrawing. And they were so certain of God's favor that they came out of the city and they assaulted the rear of the Roman army and created great devastation, slaughtered many of the Romans. And they returned to the city in triumph, bearing the spoils. By that time, every Christian was gone. As soon as the Roman armies withdrew, they believed the word of God, they saw what it meant, and they got out of Jerusalem as fast as possible. Most of them went to the city of Pella, where they found refuge. 4 years later, the Romans renewed the siege, led by Titus. And this time, there was no withdrawing. The Jews felt unto the end that their city could not be overthrown, because they knew that they were God's chosen people. They felt that nothing could overthrow the city because it belonged to God, and so they were stubborn and unyielding in their resistance. Even when Titus slaughtered, crucified Jews by the thousands, when they tried to sneak out of the city at night to gather food, to try to collect herbs and little things to eat, they were caught and crucified by the thousands outside the walls of the city. You know, Titus allowed, it was the time of the Passover, or one of these feasts. I think it was Passover. So Titus allowed the pilgrims who were journeying to Jerusalem to enter the city. Then he would not allow them to leave. So the little food supplies that they had ran out fast. And starvation conditions set in very quickly. And they began to eat donkeys, rats. They ate the leather from their shoes. It got to the place where the women began to eat their own children. And you know what happened? That eventually the Romans took the city. They shed the blood of Jews until the blood ran in the streets of the city like water. It is said that over 1 million Jews perished in that siege. And those that were left were taken away as slaves and sold to different countries. So, there are certain elements of this prophecy that I want us to look at. Jesus had said to the Jews, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, how often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her chickens under her wings, and you would not. Behold, your house is left unto you what? And that means what? They were forsaken by God. Jerusalem was a city abandoned by God. When the Roman armies took it, they called upon the name of Jehovah. They depended on him. They trusted that they were his people. They were a people forsaken by God. God had nothing to do with them. Their master was Satan, but they bore the name and they harbored the concept that they were God's people, but they were not. Now, a few interesting things that I want you to notice. And I want you to look at this carefully, because here are some things that I noticed. When Jesus said, "When you shall see the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place," where was the holy place? Outside of Jerusalem. Was Jerusalem a holy place? It was? When? When was it a holy place? Jesus refers to Jerusalem in terms of the concept that the people had of Jerusalem. Because Jerusalem was a holy city until Jesus died. You know that before, I see your hand, Michael. Before Jesus died, then the Jews were a holy people. And the city was a holy place. And Palestine was a holy land. But when Jesus died, God moved from type to antitype. And everything changed. Now God's people were no longer a genetic bloodline of a particular race. God's people were now the people who had embraced Jesus Christ and whose spirit was in his heart. Palestine was no longer a holy land, in spite of the misconception of these hundreds of different denominations that are fixated on Palestine. It was no longer a holy land. The type had moved to antitype. Our holy place is Jerusalem above, not somewhere down in the Middle East. So it was no longer a holy land. But Jesus is using the terminology that is popular and that people will understand. I'm saying this because as we consider the fulfillment in our days, we have to bear in mind certain things. Now, here are a couple of other things I want you to consider. God's people were in Jerusalem until almost the final moments. How many enemies did God's people have? Somebody says two. Who are they?
Well, the internal enemies of the church and the external enemies.
When you say the church, who do you mean?
Well, the Jews.
The Jews. And who else?
The Romans.
The Romans. There were two enemies that were determined to destroy. In fact, the Jews had been God's enemies, the enemies of God's people for 40 years. For 40 years, they had been determinedly trying to stamp out the young Christian church. When they tolerated them, it was because they couldn't do any better. They were their sworn enemies, and they were determined to wipe them out, even though they coexisted in Jerusalem. And the other enemy was Rome. And what was the nature of Rome? It was a secular power. You had two enemies of God's people, one a religious power and one a secular power. Now the religious power and the secular power got together and crucified Christ. Both of them cooperated together in persecuting God's people, but at the end, the secular power destroyed the false religious power, and God's people escaped. Because they looked for the signal and they knew when to do what, so they escaped. Now I'm suggesting to you that this is a pattern of the final abomination of desolation and how it will operate. That God's people at the end will have mistaken, I think, the nature of the final conflict. It's what I was trying to say this morning, and why I spent so much time trying to establish that the beast power is really a secular power and not a religious power. I established that because I wanted to point out this evening that according to the pattern of what happened to Jerusalem, there are two enemies that God's people have. And we have been focused on the religious enemy. But according to the type and what happened to Jerusalem, the political enemy, the secular enemy, has a role equally great or maybe even greater to play. The Bible tells us in Revelation 11, in Revelation 18, that the 10 horns in conjunction with the beast will destroy the woman. So let me ask you, let's see if we can have some equivalence here now. If we can put some names to these. So, what I'm saying is that there was a secular power. And interestingly, this power was Rome. There was a religious power. And there was God's people. Rome approached the apostate. What am I saying? This should be apostate religious, right? In fact, I'm going to put a label on it, an interesting label in just a moment. But apostate religious. Okay? Rome approached both apostate religion and true religion. And then Rome set up something called the Abomination. They set up the Abomination of Desolation, and this was followed by what? The destruction of the apostate religious power. If you were here this morning, you should be beginning to see a parallel. So, let's move to the other side of the board. We're looking at today's application. Who is the equivalent of secular Rome? That Roman power that came against God's people. And before we go there, who is the equivalent of the apostate religious Babylon? We are looking at a religious system that claims to be God's people, and the world views it as God's people, and it once used to belong to God, but which is utterly forsaken by God, which is in total rebellion and apostasy against God, and it is the enemy of God's true people. You also have God's people, and I don't know, I suppose if I ask you who are God's people, you will put different labels on it, right? Some people say it's those who keep the Sabbath. Some people say all kinds of things. But I think I would like to define it as those people who have the Spirit of God in their hearts. I'd like to leave it there. Because I think we have divided the religious world in many different ways. Some people think it's those who keep my peculiar little quirk of doctrine. And we have divided ourselves into groups and systems and organizations based on every little idea that arose in the mind of some perverse religious leader. But actually, the Bible is very simple in how it defines God's people and the rest. It says, if any man have not the Spirit of Christ, he is none of his. And as many as are led by the Spirit of God, they are the sons of God. And I want to divide the religious world along those lines. So Babylon represents the great religious system that has identified itself as belonging to God by some lines, by some means other than by the Spirit of God. Now I'm going to make an identification of Babylon here that I hope you will all understand. I am of the growing conviction that Babylon's chief identification is that of denominationalism. You may not like it initially, but I'm going to defend my position. I'll say it again. I believe that Babylon's chief identification is that of human organizational system. which usually identifies itself in denominationalism. Now, I'm going to explain why I say this from two different perspectives. First of all, when people band themselves together into groups and give themselves names and identify themselves by external means of identification, how you comb your hair, how long your dress is, the kind of things that you can say yes to when you're questioned. When they identify themselves in these ways, it sets up systems where a few men can attain almost absolute control over vast masses of people. When we have heard that the wicked are binding in bundles for the burning, you thought it applied to political parties and trade unions only. You thought it applied only to worldly organizations. Look here. Why do you think the Jews shouted, "Crucify him," to the one who blessed their babies, healed their sick, raised their dead? Why do you think they shouted, "Crucify him"? Because of a few evil men that they respected and revered. That's the nature of the human gang mentality, which is a consequence of being herded together in bands and groups and organizations. Why do you think the truth about God moves so slowly and so difficult, under such difficult circumstances? Have you ever tried to tell a Jehovah's Witness that you'll be going to heaven one day? Have you ever opened your Bible and showed him how the Bible says it over and over, and do you see what he says? He will deny every verse that says it, because the Watchtower Society teaches him otherwise. You are beating your head against a dead wall because you're not talking to somebody who is listening to evidence. You're talking to somebody who has been indoctrinated into certain ways of thinking, and primary to that is the idea that my church cannot be wrong. If you think that applies only to Adventism, you're wrong, dead wrong. But here is the second point of view from which I know that denominationalism has to be a part of the Babylonian system. Here it is. When the mark of the beast comes, whatever it is, which denomination do you think is going to maintain its position in the world and maintain its structure and its system? Which one do you think? Every single one that bows. Which one do you think won't bow? Don't you know that they are accredited and they are given permission to exist and to live and to survive by the government? Don't you know that is what denominationalism means? Don't you know it's only the crazy offshoots who cannot be controlled? Don't you know it's only you crazy people that can't be disciplined and brought under control, which is why you are going to be hated and persecuted? Don't you know that the systems that ally themselves to the government and depend on the government for their recognition and their name will find a way to compromise? Brothers and sisters, open your eyes and you'll see that I'm telling the absolute truth. No denomination. It happened in the communist Soviet Union. The churches survived. You know what the communists did? They told them who could be their pastors. They told them what they could preach. They had KGB agents sitting in the audience every Sabbath, and at every meeting you had to preach what you were told to preach. Those were not Christian churches. The Christians went underground. They could not survive in the recognized politically controlled churches. That's exactly what will happen when the mark of the beast is instituted. And therefore, I know that every religious organization that needs to survive is going to bow and receive the mark of the beast. And therefore, I am seeing that the world, yes, it will be divided along the lines of those who have the Spirit of Christ and those who don't. But visibly, outwardly, it's going to be the independents who people see as disorganized and fragmented. It will be these versus the structured, organized, well laid out systems, religious systems. They are going to stand up, but they really will be going down. So, this is the Babylon of today. And I'm saying that these, the Jews, were the Babylon of their day. This was the beast system of AD 70. And this was the Babylon of AD 70. And these were the people of God of AD 70. Am I right in saying that these were Babylon?
Amen.
The Jewish nation that thought they were God's people had become Babylon spiritually. When the Bible speaks of Babylon in Revelation 18, it says something, and I want you to think about it. Maybe I can find the exact place so we can look at it. But it says something, maybe you know it and you can finish it if I just start to quote it. It says that in her was found a certain thing. Anybody remembers? Nobody remembers. It's verse 24, Revelation 18. Thank you, Gary. Revelation 18 and verse 24. It says, in her was found the blood of prophets and of saints and of all that were slain upon the earth in Babylon. Now here's an interesting verse that I want you to look at in connection with this. Go to Matthew 23. Let's read verse 35. Jesus, speaking of the Jews and of Jerusalem, says, that upon you may come what? All the righteous blood shed upon the earth. From the blood of righteous Abel unto the blood of Zacharias, the son of Barachias, whom you slew between the temple and the altar. What was found in Jerusalem? The blood of all that were slain upon the earth. The same thing that we are told will be found in Babylon. Jerusalem, Judaism, was the Babylon of that day. It's the equivalent of the Babylon that we are looking at today. What we are looking at is a parallel. When you look at the destruction of Jerusalem, it's a parallel of the destruction of the world, of the end of the world. And the point I'm making again is that there is a secular power and there's a religious enemy. And they both work together, but at the end, the secular power turns against the religious enemy and destroys it, but God's people escape. And God's people are to look for a certain thing. What are they to look for? They are to look for some abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Now, continue to follow the parallel. The holy place in Jesus' time was where? Jerusalem. Which I'm just referring to as what? Babylon. It's Babylon. Jesus refers to the Babylon of that day, and he refers to it as the holy place because he's using the understanding that is commonly held. So we have to look for, if we are looking for a parallel, what are we looking for today? We are looking for something abominable introduced into what? Into the Babylon of today. The apostate religious system, something abominable is to be introduced in that system. And God's people, where are they? No, they are in Babylon. They are in Babylon. They are there just like the Jews were in Jerusalem. God's people are there. So they are to look for the abomination of desolation. And when it stands in Babylon, when the mark of Rome, the secular power, when that mark is set up in the apostate religious system, God's people who are in there, what do? Get out. Read Revelation 18 and you'll find that's what exactly happened. It says, and I heard another voice from heaven. What did it say? Babylon is fallen. Come out of her, my people, or else you are going to receive of her sins. And you're going to partake of her sins and receive of her plagues. When this abomination of desolation stands in the so-called holy place, it's a signal for God's people, those of you who are still associated with these apostate systems. Then you know that the romance is finally, irrevocably over. Get out. Up to that point, God winks at your ignorance and he forgives the loyalty and the fellowship that makes you want to hang around. But there comes a time when something is so clearly rotten and apostate and lost, you just have got to get out. Something is to happen in the religious world. Something is to be established in the churches that is so absolutely clearly abominable that everybody with a modicum of sense will know I can no longer associate with this thing. Then when you tell people get out of Babylon, they will know what you're talking about. Tell people get out of Babylon today, and what are you telling them? All right. They don't keep the Sabbath. Look, Babylon has hardly ever kept the Sabbath for the past 2,000 years. That's not present truth. Well, the Trinity, that's a significant thing. Yes, they rejected the true God. But how long ago was that? Well, the Adventist Church was 1980, but the rest of Babylon, when did they reject the true God? It has been ages. What I'm saying is that when you focus on this, it doesn't have the power that it should because it's not present. When the call goes, get out of Babylon, it is something visible and clear and unmistakable and beyond controversy that every intelligent Christian who remains in Babylon will flee out of it. That's what I understand this prophecy means. The Spirit of God is to be cut off from the churches. The daily is to be taken away. The Spirit of God is to be driven out of the churches by their mingling with the system of the world. But something in particular is to be established that is so ugly and horrendous and abominable and clearly of the devil that everybody will see. And every true Christian will get out without hesitation. Right now, I probably am not going to tell you what I think it is. But I should. Okay? I should. I don't know. But I have an idea that may be just as good as anybody else's idea. But I came this morning, suggested one or two things, just so you know that what we're doing is making suggestions. I can't tell you definitively it is so, but I'm going to tell you there's something on the horizon. And it is growing and it is swelling. It's the first thing that the Bible ever refers to. The first sin that is ever referred to in the Bible as an abomination. The first sin. If you don't know what I'm talking about, go to the Bible, look at the word abomination, and find out where first it is used to identify a particular sin. And you'll find the answer to what I'm talking about. It's an abomination. When it appeared in the past, God says that he destroyed an entire city because they committed abominations, and he was referring to this particular thing. All right, I've said enough, so let me come straight and tell you what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the acceptance of homosexuality, and in particular homosexual marriage. Now, let me pause a little bit and say something. Jesus loves sinners. That's why I am saved. That's why I have the privilege of standing here, because I have been the chiefest of sinners. God loves homosexuals, and I pity and I have sympathy for people who struggle with sin. It doesn't matter what kind of sin. But I have strong aversion to people who are barefaced and defiant in their sin. That I have a problem with. I have a problem with false scientific studies and lies that convince people that God's word is a lie. I have a problem when the planet is trying to push something down the throat of every person that God says is an abomination. Now the thing is, this morning Brother Ken was saying, and I've read the statistics, 54% of Catholics in America are in favor of homosexual marriage. The disciples of Christ have officially accepted homosexual marriage. The Church of England has officially accepted it. There's a church in, I think it's in Minneapolis, a Baptist church, which has refused to conduct any more weddings until it is legal for homosexuals to be married. It is spreading and intruding itself into the Christian church. I just read an article today, I was showing Brother Howard, where the Pope says he thinks that people are talking too much about abortion and homosexuality. It's not that important, I think. Right? He himself said recently that he thinks that God accepts everyone when he was questioned about homosexuality. And there is a mood that is taking place. I'm going to tell you, right here in America, the Supreme Court took a decision. And so every church has to be doing introspection. What are they going to do to survive? If it becomes a human right, which is where the governments of the world are pushing, it's already so in Canada. In Canada, you cannot refuse, if you're a minister, you cannot as a church refuse to marry homosexuals. You can't. Also in Denmark, it is law that every church has to accept homosexuals if they come to be married. You as a minister can opt out, but you have to get a minister to replace you. So it's not something that is being left to people's conscience and for you to be free to do what you want to do. People are innocent and they don't know what is happening. Like I was saying to somebody, the United States and the European Union are pushing homosexuality on every country on the planet. Recently, the United States Secretary of State, John Kerry, stated that the promotion of gay rights is at the heart of U.S. foreign policy. What? You have Syria to worry about. You have your economy to worry about. And at the heart of your foreign policy, you have put homosexuality? What on earth is going on? The British Prime Minister went to Uganda, Zambia. Mr. Obama was there, and he offended the people by pushing it on these nations. In Jamaica, they have threatened us that if we don't change our laws, because it's still illegal in Jamaica, then we are going to lose the assistance we get from the EU and from America. So there is this push to promote it. But the greatest influence is the influence of false science. Because you know, Gary, that the people who are worshipped today are doctors and psychologists and scientists. The new gods, the gods of this age, are scientists. Science is the god of this age. You go and tell somebody, God says spank your children. The psychiatrist says don't, and the government goes at the psychiatrist and he says if you touch a child, it's jail for you. They say homosexuality is a genetic disorder, is a genetic thing. You are born this way. So they have been searching for a homosexual gene. They cannot find it. But they are still convinced that people are born this way, and they say, therefore, it's like my skin is black. I was born this way. It's unfair to discriminate against me because of the color of my skin. I agree. I was born this way. But they have now convinced the world. Everybody believes that it's a condition that you're born with. So who are you bigoted people to think this thing is wrong? And I'm going to tell you, I've been reading up on this thing for the past year or so, and I'm telling you, if you want to see hatred and vitriol, read some of these forums. The group that is hated the most is Christianity. And the group that is most supportive of this particular thing, I bet you never tell me who it is. It's strange. It's atheists. That's what started me looking at this, because I was looking at some debates between Christians and atheists. You know, there are 4 atheists in particular who are called the 4 horsemen. They are called the new atheists because they are on a crusade to destroy Christianity. Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, and another one. Hitchens died. I hesitate to say thankfully, but it's in my heart to say. But they are determined to wipe out Christianity. And I'm going to read something that Dawkins says tomorrow night to illustrate the way they feel about Christianity. And the thing is, right now in this world, the only thing that stands in the way of homosexuality being accepted everywhere, what do you think is the greatest obstacle? Christianity! Religion in general, but in particular the monotheistic religions, and especially Christianity. Why the monotheistic religions? Because the monotheistic religions believe there's one God. And if there's one God, there's one morality. And if there's one morality, you can't adjust it or change it. So they hate Islam, and they hate Judaism, and they hate Christianity most of all. And they are determined never to rest until Christianity becomes an obsolete institution. Read what is happening, and this is exactly the mood that you see out there in the atheistic world. And you can see it happening. They have driven any mention of God out of the educational system. But evolution and atheism is being pushed down the throat of everybody. And now homosexuality is being taught in the schools. And you parents don't have the right to know when your children are being taught, or to resist if your children are being taught this in school. Thankfully in America you can still homeschool. You can't do it in Germany and most European countries. You have to send your children there to be indoctrinated in atheism and homosexuality, and you cannot remove your children. They'll be taken from you. What kind of world are we living in? Do we see what is coming? And America is fast adopting the same kinds of principles. Now I know I'm a stranger here, and I don't want them to deport me until God is ready for me never to come back. But the thing is, I have to say it, and hope nobody will report me. I have to say the truth. This is what is happening, and I'm not raging or railing against homosexuality, because every sin is the same sin. But what I'm concerned about is that the Bible tells us that something is to be established and it is to be set up in the churches. And I have a suspicion it has to do with this. I say suspicion, okay? So don't burn me or hang me or crucify me. I have a suspicion. You might have another suspicion. I'd like to hear it. So far, up to this moment, there's nothing else I see that has the push and the focus and the potential of this particular thing. Look, when this becomes a human rights issue, so far the United Nations has not proclaimed it a human rights issue, because there are still too many countries in the backwoods of Africa and the Caribbean who resist it. But all the developed countries have accepted it. New Zealand got on board a few months ago. France this year, I'm talking about men marrying to men. England this year, France this year, New Zealand this year. And before that, there were most of the countries in Europe, and now America in several states. And it's moving like a tidal wave, and it cannot be resisted. This country is going down in that respect. You can't resist it. The Supreme Court, you'd have thought that 5 sensible old men would have been able to stand up and make a better decision. No! You cannot resist it. And I don't know why, because these people make up about 3% of the population. I think atheists are 12, they are 3%, and they dominate the country. And they're taking over everything. And you wonder why? How is this happening? I don't know, but I know it's happening. And when it becomes a human rights issue, what are the churches going to do? Because right now it's a matter of choice and preference, but when it's human rights, you don't have the right to not give these people the same rights as you give to a heterosexual couple. So when they come to be married, every church will have to accept that it's a right to marry these people. In England, the Hindus have stopped marrying people. Why? Because they don't want to be sued. Because they recognize that soon it's going to be a matter of law that every church has to marry homosexuals or be sued. You know what is happening here in America, in Washington, right? This little old lady, she sells flowers. So homosexuals came and they wanted her to cater for their wedding. She says, I'm a Christian, I can't do this. They have sued her. The state has found her guilty, and she's charged a huge amount of money. The people sued her, and now the state is suing her in addition to that. A little 72-year-old lady. And several motels, small motels in England and in Hawaii and other places have been sued also because they didn't allow homosexual couples to share the same bed. And your freedom to, as an individual, I mean, where was it? Was it Canada? The judge made a decision. No, it was in Washington. The judge made a statement when he found this little lady guilty, and he fined her. He said, sometimes the rights of an individual have to be sacrificed in order for the greater good of the society in which you live. That's what he said. Now, if you have a nose to smell what is happening, you can smell what that means. In Canada, a man was handing out tracts. They were simply tracts with Bible verses relating to homosexuality. He was asking people to not allow these laws to be made to indoctrinate the children in schools. He was fined 7,500 Canadian dollars for handing out 2 tracts with just Bible verses on it. And the Human Rights Court said, when it comes to matters of human rights, you cannot claim religious freedom. He says, when you take Bible verses and put them together in this way, it constitutes hate speech. Now, I understand that many of us are not aware of what is happening. Right? Now, there is a DVD at the back and there's a book at the back, but the DVD especially has a lot of these articles in a PowerPoint form. There are 3 sermons. The third one has all of this on it. So if you can get a hold of one of those, you can look at it. I don't have the time at this camp meeting to show the PowerPoint, but all of this and much, much more is happening. And I'm going to tell you, the only thing that can stop this agenda, what is happening, the only thing that can stop it, is if there is a complete moral revolution in the entire planet. The only thing that can stop it is if Satan appears on this world as Jesus Christ. Now, if that happens, the world will turn back to religion, probably. Satan's religion. But no human effort or energy. The trend of the direction in which society is progressing, it cannot be reversed short of something like that. Men are not afraid anymore by Hurricane Katrina, or by the greatest earthquakes, or by Fukushima. Science explains all these things. Richard Dawkins says if he saw God appear in the sky, he still wouldn't believe in him. Because he says people will use holograms and so forth. Science has convinced men that they are lords of the universe and God does not exist. And it takes something beyond the controversy to turn this planet around. So, I'm speaking from the position of the trend that I see taking place. From the perspective of looking at the prophecy and what I see there. I'm not saying to anybody that what I'm saying is absolutely right, because I would be presumptuous to do this. But I'm saying I think my perspective has a lot of good reasoning behind it. And I want you to think about it and look at it. Because one thing I've been saying, Brother Howard has repeated it, what is coming is not going away, it's coming. And it's coming rapidly, so we will soon know. For sure. We don't have to speculate about it. And thank God we're not quarreling and arguing about it. But I just want you to open your eyes and start looking if you have not been looking before, because something is coming. And I'm going to tell you this. If homosexuality is accepted by the churches, you will have a reason, and you'll have a purpose, and you'll have strength when you tell people, get out! I have right here on my iPad now, but it's a little small to show you, where a group of Adventist ministers and theologians in California, Nam, what Nam is he? Julius Nam. You've heard that name. He's a professor at Loma Linda, I believe, right? And several ministers and leading Adventist theologians, they have made a tape asking Adventists to vote that homosexual marriage might be retained in California. Retained. Asking Adventists, and they say, we need to do this. Why? Because we believe in religious liberty. These people should be free to have their religious liberty. So let's vote that they be free to marry each other. Look, they do it in the name of religious liberty. If you don't have any sense, it might make sense to you. Right? Yeah. I mean, some gay Adventists fine, but it's not officially recognized by the church. But these are a group of leading Adventist leaders, theologians and ministers, practicing present ministers, and they are putting their arguments to the church. It's survival, that is the name of the game, survival. Churches must survive. If you think that the purpose of denominations is to propagate the gospel, they might start out this way, but they morph into institutions that exist for business reasons, and they must survive at all costs. That's the name of the game. And I'm asking you, I'm about to end here, but I'm asking you to consider what I'm saying, because, like I say, whatever is happening, it's happening rapidly. All the observers have said that there's something strange about this homosexual movement, because it is the fastest growing movement on the planet. And that's strange. That's strange. Why is it growing so fast? There seems to be more than human elements behind it. So what I'm saying is, if there's anything to what I'm saying, we will find out soon enough, because it's coming rapidly. And if there's nothing to it, let's keep our eyes open. Let's keep on studying. We know that we have long expected an assault from a certain direction. Keep our eyes there, but don't ignore what else is happening. That's what I'm saying. So, thank you very much for your attentiveness. I hope what I've said at least opens our eyes a little bit and makes us more alert. That's what I hope that by God's grace will happen after our talk tonight.